All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Debbie Cox-Bolton. I'm the CEO of NewDEAL. This is Juneteenth, an immensely important day in our country's history, and I'm glad that you could spend part of that day with us today for what is the second in a series that we're doing on race in America. The NewDEAL is a national network of diverse, exceptional state and local elected officials. In these extraordinary times, in the middle of a pandemic and a recession, we join Americans everywhere calling for equality and justice, and we're committed to helping NewDEAL leaders who are working toward long overdue change. We were heartened this week by the congressional Democrats' proposals on reform, but as President Obama recently said, the elected officials who matter most in reforming police departments and criminal justice system work at the state and local levels. Addressing systemic racism is a top priority for our organization. We're creating a database to track and share local and state ideas on reforming police and criminal justice systems. And we're launching a Renewing America task force, which will make specific policy recommendations on a host of issues from housing to small business, about how not we just return to an old normal, but how we rebuild an America that works better for everyone. Today, we're honored to have with us two incredible leaders for a conversation about how we can ensure that this historic moment becomes a systemic movement toward real and lasting change. We will be doing questions with our speakers. So if you would like to submit a question, please use that Q&A button to do so. And we will just go ahead and get started. I'm delighted first to introduce Michael Smith. Michael was part of the Obama White House team that designed and launched My Brother's Keeper initiative. He now serves as the Director of Youth Opportunity Programs and Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. This alliance leads a national call to action to build safe and supportive communities for boys and young men of color, where they're valued and have a clear pathway to opportunity. In recent weeks, many NewDEAL mayors have signed on to the Obama Pledge to engage their communities to review and reform their police use of force policies. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
Happy to have you. I'll just turn it over to you to tell us what's going on with My Brother's Keeper and how you feel about making some real change in this moment.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. And again, thanks for having me here. And thank you to all of the local leaders who, stepped up. So many people could be having lives of relative comfort and peace, doing things right now that aren't on the front lines of social change and social justice. And so, we know how hard public service is. We know how hard it is to be in the arena where you're working for creating change. So thank you. And thank you for so many of you who have been partners with My Brother's Keeper local and nationally for years. I'll tell you a little bit just briefly for those of you who aren't familiar with My Brother's Keeper about what My Brother's Keeper is overall. And then I'll talk a little bit about this moment that we're in and how we're beginning to respond. So My Brother's Keeper has its roots in the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin, and more importantly, the verdict in the Trayvon Martin case where George Zimmerman was set free. At that time, President Obama was especially concerned about how young men of color were feeling that their country felt about them, and what does it say to a young man of color about the value of their lives. So the president really wanted to have a moment where we wrapped our arms around young men of color and said, you matter, and that we're going to do everything we can to support you. The other thing that happened is while the entire domestic policy agenda in the Obama administration was about creating this opportunity for all society, we were seeing data that was showing if you were Black, Latinx, or tribal young man, you were falling behind in every major indicator of long-term life success that mattered, whether it was third grade reading or the high school dropout rate. We were celebrating, we had turned the curve on the high school dropout rate, and we had 82% graduation rate. But if you were Black, Latinx, or tribal, you were still seeing graduation rates of 50% or less. And so we were really concerned about this data and said, obviously what we're doing is not enough. So the president pulled together a team to think about what we could do. And you may remember after the verdict in the case, President Obama surprised the press briefing corps and talked honestly about kind of the hurt and anger and anguish that Black and brown families were feeling in this moment. And that was the time where he said, Trayvon could have been me. He said, Trayvon could have been my son. And he said, there has to be more that we can do to make sure young men of color know that their country cares about them and are willing to invest in them. And so he didn't want to just have a roundtable. He didn't want to just have a mentoring drive. He wanted to bring data, evidence, and the full weight of the federal government behind us to see what we could do about these issues. So fast forward 6 months later, in the East Room of the White House, the president was surrounded by young men of color, signed a presidential memorandum creating the My Brother's Keeper initiative. And as we think about this moment where we're turning from anguish to action that we talk about at the Obama Foundation, and making sure that protest leads to policy change, that was really at the root of My Brother's Keeper. This idea that we had 22 federal agencies and White House offices that were all working on reducing barriers and expanding opportunity for boys and young men of color. So things like Second Chance Pell and rethinking school discipline, chronic absenteeism work, new partnerships between the Department of Education and the Department of Justice to rethink correctional education. All of those things came from the My Brother's Keeper Task Force table. The work of My Brother's Keeper now lives at the Obama Foundation as the My Brother's Keeper Alliance. And now that we don't have the full weight of the federal government anymore, we had to really think about what do we do now. And so our focus now is how do we build safe and supportive communities for boys and young men of color where they feel valued and have clear pathways to opportunity. And we're doing that through a couple different ways. One, we have a network of more than 250 My Brother's Keeper communities in all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and 19 tribal nations. We ran a grant competition that we announced the winners of in late 2018, where we're actually investing in 15 communities across the country that are scaling programmatic interventions around youth violence prevention, second chances, and effective mentoring programs. We're helping support them with staff, evaluation, marketing, and helping them to bring the community together to create lasting solutions and thinking about policy change as well. In addition to those small group of communities, we have a framework for change that we think about with the rest of our communities. We convene them. When we all used to be able to convene in person, we would do big in-person convenings or regional convenings. Now, a lot of our online town halls and meetings. And then we try to provide on-ramps, whether you're a mom or a mayor, how you can get involved to support this work. And so at this moment that we're in, that APA has dubbed a racism pandemic, where you have the compounding effects of the COVID-19 that's having such a disproportionate impact on illnesses and deaths in the African American and Latinx and tribal communities. And now you have this police violence that we know that we've had to deal with way too often, but has become more visible recently. We had to figure out, what do we do? How do we pivot? So we've been working closely with our communities, trying to figure out how we can funnel more dollars, trying to figure out how we connect with more entities that can think about resources to support our communities. Also, how do we lift up the experts that can help people think about how we operate in this new normal? So you may have seen some of the town halls that we've done on this topic. Most recently on the issue of reimagining policing with President Obama, AG Holder, and other leaders. As a part of our Reimagining Policing Town Hall, we launched our Mayor's Pledge. And the idea behind that, this was almost 3 weeks ago, we really just wanted to make sure that we wouldn't just end on anger, and that we wouldn't just see a slate of press releases and people, declaring holidays or meeting with community leaders, but that we'd actually get some real action and change. So we created this pledge as a way to ask mayors, county executives, to commit within the next 90 days of reviewing their use of force policies, doing that in partnership with members of the community, and then reporting out on the real change that's going to take place to use of force policies and reimagining public safety in general in 90 days. We're going to spotlight mayors that are a part of this, and then in 90 days, maybe more like 100, we'll actually do a report where we'll let people know who was in the pledge and some of the progress that has taken place. So that is a beginning step. We're working with our partnerships at the Leadership Conference for Human and Civil Rights, National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, Cities United, also to provide technical assistance to mayors and their staff over the course of the next several weeks to make sure there's a full understanding of how does police accountability work and what are the range of policy solutions that we should be looking at going forward. We're also encouraging everyone to become an MBK community. So there are 250 now, but if your community, if you go to obama.org and you don't see your community, we have steps that you can take to join us and become a part of this powerful network that is not only responding in this moment, but thinking about how we can create safe and supportive communities for the long haul for our young men of color, and all of the young people in our community that are marginalized. So I'll stop there and perhaps see if there are any questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael. Super exciting what you're doing and important. I know that a lot of people joined after our opening, so I do just want to reiterate that you can use the Q&A button to ask us some questions for Michael and Bakari Sellers when he joins us. But we also asked for some questions ahead of time, Michael. So I've got a number of those sitting here. So let me start by asking you. You mentioned this pledge, the mayor's pledge, which is only 3 weeks old. But are you seeing any kind of best practices already in terms of the thinking about how to engage the communities in the conversation, to look and review at the police departments? How's that going?
Yeah, well, let me first say there's more than 100 mayors that have released public statements in support of the pledge, and we're going through hundreds of requests that have come in from communities that want to take the pledge, and we're working to respond to them right now and vet that they're real people, and we'll be releasing those names shortly. You know, what's been really exciting about this moment is we are seeing people act incredibly quickly. We are seeing, we're seeing some communities where the activists are coming in and sitting alongside with the mayors and having real dialogue. We're seeing people taking advantage of technology and having opportunities to engage with diverse participants in their community. So, if you think about times gone past, these things would stretch on for weeks and months, and it still will, right? Like we're in the first phase of this process. There will be ups and downs, but even in places like Minneapolis have already committed to make some pretty major changes. Los Angeles, some pretty major changes that will be taking place. So excited to see that, and excited to see the way that community members are coming in to talk about this work.
That's fantastic. And I know that rightfully you're focused right now with the pledge on cities specifically, New Deal leaders. We have, as I mentioned, a number of mayors who have signed on already to that pledge. We also work with state elected officials as well. So we'll have some of those on the call. Is there state level reforms that you're also looking at, or do you have resources that you might point those folks to?
Yeah, I would, right now we're starting with mayors, just that is the community that we deal the most with. That's a part of the MBK family. There are a few state chapters for My Brother's Keepers, such as in Ohio and MBK New York State. But right now, we at the Obama Foundation, My Brother's Keeper Alliance, are focused on the local elected officials in the form of mayors and county executives. Our partners at Leadership Conference have incredible resources that we link to from our website at obama.org and are providing new resources every day for people that are at every single level, all the way up to federal lawmakers.
Fantastic. We'll make sure that we link to that to our website and make that available for our New Deal leaders as well. That's great. A question we had earlier was about, you mentioned COVID and this kind of perfect storm of things we're dealing with at once. And someone had asked us, how does COVID play as a backdrop to the recent outcry against police brutality? And has the pandemic, do you think, helped or hurt kind of galvanize support for what we are now seeing as inequalities, not just in policing, as you mentioned, but in all kinds of things? For example, the disproportionate effect that COVID itself has had on communities of color. How do you think that's all playing in terms of whether or not this is going to be a moment we can really affect real change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are all sorts of academics and historians that will examine this moment. But what we're seeing right now is the perfect storm of tragedy. If you are Black and brown in America, we went from a situation where all of a sudden we're having to deal with this pandemic, and then all of a sudden that we're seeing double, triple, quadruple rates of illness and deaths that are taking place in our communities, and our families are having to respond to this. We also then saw many organizations that don't have the level of resources that they need. They're having to respond not only to the ongoing challenges of making up for the fact that so many communities have let down people of color in this country for so many years. They are also not only meeting those basic needs, but they're providing PPE. We have nonprofits that are providing laptops for young people to help them with education, providing gaming systems. We have at least 2 of our grantees that are serving hundreds of meals per week. And so you're dealing with incredible devastation, which just shows how racism literally kills. And, we see it slowly, we talk about it all the time, and then we see it in the justice system, and now we're seeing it, live and on color in these horrific videos that are taking place. And so I think what's happened is while Black and brown Americans are dealing with this anguish, it has just brought into focus why we have to take drastic actions to solve these drastic solutions that have come about over the course of hundreds of years. And so I do think it helped to put it into focus. Black and brown folks have been dealing with this their entire lives. I think it helped to put it into focus for people that may not have been watching. And frankly, I think, people have a little bit more attention to give right now, especially those folks that are working from home. What my hope is that we will continue to have sustained engagement and sustained action for the months and years to come, because we know that this isn't going to be a short battle. And what I'm heartened to see are the companies, for instance, that aren't just releasing statements to say Black Lives Matter, but are releasing statements to say how many new Black and brown chief executives we're going to have, how much more business we're going to give to Black and brown communities. The policy change that will be so important. And, we're going to have to keep the drumbeat up, and we're going to have to be steady about it. And we're going to have to hold our feet to the fire when we get tired, and then hold other influencers' feet to the fire as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, we had a question about kind of the November elections, just in terms of how do you feel like, what's your hope for, and what's your thinking about how the protests, might just influence the elections, not in terms of specific candidates, but just, what do you think that, what do you think the impact's going to be on the elections in November?
Yeah, I smile a little bit because as an employee of the Obama Foundation, we kind of steer pretty clear of electoral politics. Obviously, voting matters, and President Obama and Mrs. Obama have said this over and over again, and made sure every time that they talk about these issues, even when President Obama has been on our national town hall, of praising and thanking and lifting up, especially so many young people that are putting themselves in the way and being on the front line and protesting, but also reminding people that we have to combine protesting with making sure that we have policymakers that share our ideals and are going to listen to those protests and turn that protest into legislation that actually changes lives. That is about the systemic and not the superficial. So of course, we are excited about folks registering and going out and making their voice heard through voting and through all sorts of other ways that we can engage civically. Great.
Let me ask you a final question here, as Bakari, I think, is coming on. This is from one of our audience members. Has there been any engagement with leaders of the grassroots movement to review what, if any, parts of their demands should be incorporated into policy? You talked a little bit about this. You talked about the some of the reviewing the police department specifically on use of force policies, but anything else in terms of specific policies that you are recommending in kind of the broader criminal justice reform efforts?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that we are not a civil rights organization at the Obama Foundation, and that's why we are partnering with folks like the Leadership Conference that have been doing this work for many years, that have the expertise that can drive it home. And so what we're trying to do is listen to the folks on the ground. We are talking to activists, we are talking to movement leaders, and then connect and lift up those folks that can really help people drive meaningful change. So, even for reviewing use of force policies and thinking about reimagining public safety, we don't have an agenda. President Obama had a task force on 21st century policing. We continue to believe those recommendations are strong. The Leadership Conference took that report and updated it. We linked to it so people can take a look. There's a toolkit on how they can, what folks should be able to do to think about implementing some of those policies. So we are not, from the Obama Foundation, saying here are the 5, 6, 7, 8 things you can do. We are saying here's what we have seen that has worked. Here's the spectrum of solutions, and here are the types of organizations that have a track record of success. And one of the things that we've also done, we created this Anguish in Action website where we actually list many of the organizations, many of whom are on the ground organizations or have affiliate networks, so that we hope that communities will support them with their time, their talent, and their treasure. And hopefully those are the types of folks that mayors, for instance, will consider working with and bringing in, so that we're not just listening to the same voices over and over again, but that we're bringing in the traditionally marginalized and disenfranchised voices to help shape this conversation. It's been extraordinary to me, not only the speed of action that we're seeing on these issues, but the imagination that's happening, that this is not just a moment to pick at the edges, but to really look at the harm and the hurt that got us here and start to think about reforming from the inside out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And I'll just reiterate too that we're excited to put together this database that we'll have launched shortly on policies that state and local leaders, New Deal leaders around the country are doing on police reform, on criminal justice reform. Just to your point, there's so much imagination out there and people looking at things in a different way, and we want to do our part to help share and spread those good ideas. So, so thank you. Thanks for being with us. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to our second speaker, Bakari Sellers. It is really lovely to see you, my friend. It's been a while. So let me introduce Bakari, who really needs no introduction, but I've had the privilege to know Bakari since 2007, when he was serving as the youngest member of the South Carolina State Legislature and the youngest African-American elected official in the country. He ran a historic race for lieutenant governor in 2014. Many of you, I'm sure, know Bakari as a frequent CNN commentator and as a really powerful national voice on the intersection of race and politics. And he is the author of a new New York Times bestselling memoir, which I'm really thrilled for you about. It's called My Vanishing Country. It's phenomenal, it's timely, it's important. I just finished it myself and I can't recommend it enough. Thank you for your voice in all of this. So Bakari, welcome, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege. And Michael, I seem to be bumping to you in all the right spaces. You know, I love the work that you guys are doing at the Obama Foundation. It's just awesome, especially during this time. And I can say I'm probably speaking for most, if not 100 million Americans who are simply grateful to hear the president's voice. I think it was last week or week before last with this town hall that he did with Brittany Packnett and Phil Goff and many others, especially in this space. And your leadership has always been great. And I'm just appreciative of that. Debbie, you disappeared on me on the screen, but that's fine. I am grateful for your friendship. You invited me down to Little Rock, Arkansas, when I was 22 years old, I believe it was, 23 years old. And I was in a room with some amazing leaders like Tobias Reed and Chris Coons. We learned from Al Fromm. Jeff Danielson, I can't forget Jeff. We learned from so many amazing people. And it's just an honor to be here with you today. As I have to apologize because you probably will hear 17-month-old twins in the background. They love the camera just as much as their dad does, I guess. Just know that they are here and they are the future leaders of tomorrow as they run through the house. I'm happy to be here at this amazing date. You know, and I guess I think Michael and I will have a discussion, but I'm happy to be here at this amazing time because we're sitting here on Juneteenth. And, you know, I'm reminded, imagine if you find out you've been freed 2.5 years later. You've been doing all of this work for 2.5 years only to find out that you have been free. And it just puts me in a place of great pride, but also puts me in a place of great anguish. Because it just reminds us that, you know, 401 years in this country. And you're talking about slavery and bondage. You're talking about that anger that Michael was talking about, that anguish that led us to this point. I'll give two somewhat quick anecdotes and then mention a story that I talk about in my book. The first is, you know, when we saw George Floyd with a knee to his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think that everyone on this call realizes that the common denominator, the common theme in that was the inhumanity. And that inhumanity is what has awoken and sparked the consciousness of the country. And, you know, one of the things that I always am reminded of is that, you know, there are many people of color in this country who do not get the benefit of their humanity. And that goes back to Emmett Till. It goes to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It goes to February 8th of '68, where my father was shot. It goes to the assassination of King in April of '68, or RFK in June of '68. And so as we think about all of these things, you know, for me, it's just, again, this perspective, this context, that we remember that people are not in the streets right now simply protesting because of George or Ahmaud or Breonna or David. But they're protesting because of 401 years of slavery, degradation, and oppression. And the systemic injustice and systemic racism that's prevalent in this country is something that we have to work collaboratively with groups like this of good, like-minded folk who want to uproot these institutions and reimagine them. The great thing about the New Deal and what Debbie is doing is they give us the resources and tools to reimagine. I don't want anybody to leave this thinking that they can go back to their cities, states, local municipalities, school boards, foundations, or whatever it may be, and do business as usual and think you're going to have a change. You have to reimagine it. And so I am someone who wants to break a cycle. And why do I say break a cycle? Because being Black in this country, I've deduced is being in a perpetual state of grieving. We go through this violent act. We have this pain that boils over into the streets. We have this outrage. Then we have this sadness. Then we have these homegoing celebrations where we uplift and remember and commemorate. And then we do it all over again. And so we have to be willing to break that cycle. My daughter was protesting last week, 2 weeks ago. And she and her girlfriends, she's 15. They painted Black Lives Matter signs. They went out in the streets, protested. And there was this great sense of pride you have from that, but it's also some sadness because you're like, why can't my daughter just be like Barron Trump? Why can't she just be a teenager that doesn't have to go out and reaffirm her Blackness in the streets or that her life matters? It took us 7 years just to get the country to say Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm on TV and I looked at myself in the mirror after I got off TV. I was like, you just applauded Mitt Romney. Do you realize Mitt didn't do anything? He didn't put forth a bill. He didn't push forth any policy. He just said Black Lives Matter, like the bare minimum. And that is kind of where we are. And so although we have this hope, right? And although we are very excited about where we are, I've always said that we made progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. And that old political adage that we have to trust but verify. And the last thing that I'll say about this moment is to talk about how deeply rooted race is in our country. My Vanishing Country has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for 3 weeks, and it is a pinnacle of success in my life. I'm so fortunate. I'm from a small town called Denmark where we had 3 stoplights and a blinking light. And I'm reminded that I'm probably the first New York Times bestseller from Denmark, and you can't take that away from me. I want them to put my book cover up in the high school gymnasium. I'm so excited. But every time I sign this book, I sign a name that's not my own. Every time I sign Bakari Sellers, I'm signing my last name of people who owned my family when we came into this country from Sierra Leone and docked off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. 2 brothers. One was a Sellers and one was a Millhouse. And so even at the pinnacle of success in my life, I am still writing a name that is rooted in slavery, rooted in that type of pain. And so I'm happy to be here with you guys today. I am happy to be with Michael. I'm happy to be with Debbie, all the New Deal leaders, not just of yesterday, but the new ones, the ones who keep coming in. This is one of the greatest organizations we have in American politics, not just Democratic politics or anything of the sort. And I am just happy to be here with you all. Michael, Debbie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bakari, for that. I mean, so powerful. And we have a couple questions. I want to remind people if they'd like to ask a question to Bakari, you can do so by using the Q&A button. But we had some in advance, Bakari, so I'll go ahead and ask you a few if you're game. First of all, you alluded to in the book. I was so struck by the conversation, the narrative you told about your family and your dad as well, obviously being shot and then wrongly jailed for the Orangeburg massacre. I'm just wondering, this is a threshold question. Your family's been at this a long time. So do you feel like this is a different moment in history where something, some real lasting change can happen?
That's a loaded question. I mean, you're channeling your inner Chris Cuomo there, Debbie, with that question. I'm hopeful and I'm faithful, but we've been here before. And so I'm deathly afraid that we'll miss this moment. Right? I'm a Swiftie. I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I mean, what else? I mean, I said this on TV the other day and got more positive and hate mail than you can imagine. But I think Red was a better album than 1989. I mean, I just firmly believe that as a Swiftie. But watching her voice is amazing. I'm a big Gamecock fan. I hate Clemson football, but Trevor Lawrence, the quarterback from Clemson, is speaking up and speaking out. Much props to him. NASCAR, Bubba Wallace. In the South, NASCAR banning Confederate flags. That's not a thing that happens. Bubba Wallace, being able to race with Black Lives Matter on his car. And he had the 17th fastest car and he finished 11th. I mean, that's nothing but the ancestors pulling him over because they gave him that slow car. So, you know, you just, something is happening, but, you know, we're here with Emmett, you know, Mamie Till let the world see her son's face in 55. And it was on Ebony magazine. You know, it was a big picture in Ebony. It was an open casket. They brutally beat him and threw him in the bottom of the Mississippi. Nothing changed. Then the first time, I mean, I can't remember who the host was. I don't want to dare say it was Brokaw. It was before then. I can't remember his name, but on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you've had those images that were on the 5:30 and 6 o'clock and 6:30 news for the first time ever, and the country was watching. Nothing really changed. And then, you know, just 2 days ago, we remembered the 5-year anniversary of my good friend Clem being killed in the Charleston massacre, along with 8 others. And with all due respect to my friend Michael up here, our president sung the most off-key version of Amazing Grace ever. That man didn't hit a note to save his life. But during that moment, it was like a whole piece just came over me, man. It was just that feeling. I was sitting next to Sunny Hostin from The View. Back when she was at CNN, and we were watching the funeral together, and we were sitting there, and he took this pause, like this pregnant pause. And I didn't know if something happened to him. I'm crying, and then he takes this deep pause, and we all look up, and then he starts singing Amazing Grace. And at that moment, you're just like, okay, like you were ready to run through a brick wall. You're like, the patriotism is just dripping from your spirit. And you're like, we're going to have the country that upholds not just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but those words like love and justice and truth and peace and freedom. And then we missed that moment. And so this has been a good week in American history. I mean, I know the president has acknowledged Juneteenth for the rest of us. He invented the holiday, and now we all know about it thanks to him. But even regardless of that, we've had 2 good rulings from the Supreme Court this week. You know, on discrimination and on DACA. You know, we are having people who are still in the streets. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 382 days. So those people who are protesting, remember that you just on day like 25. This ain't nowhere near over. And so I am in a good place. And I think that you answer your question in a very long-winded way. I'm hopeful and faithful. We just have to take it one day at a time.
Or you were in the legislature, so going from exactly where you left that question to how we make sure that we fulfill that hope. You know, you were a legislator. There's a lot of legislators and other state and local electeds on this call. It's a huge question, because we know this is not just about police reform or just about criminal justice reform. This is about housing and economic, you know, entrepreneurship and so many things. But do you have any thoughts about, you know, kind of what you would say to people about, you know, where we should start, or, you know, or if you're going to focus on some things, where would you be looking?
So let me give you a policy framework, Debbie, and I know you'll appreciate this, that there are 2 policy frameworks. Both of these are my criticisms of both parties in terms of the way that we legislate. Democrats drive me crazy with this more so than even Republicans, because my level of expectation is a little bit lower. But we legislate with stop signs in our heads as Democrats. Like we always want to ease into things. And I want us to be individuals who think big when it comes to, and that's why I use the word, instead of reforming, I use the word reimagine, right? From the ground up, the fundamental tenets. Imagine your house is the United States of America. You love this place, but we are going to only keep the frame. We're going to go in and gut it and reimagine the way that this house will look. That's first. And the second thing that drives me crazy, especially about Democratic leadership, and I love them all, but you cannot have race neutral policies for race specific problems, right? Like a rising tide does not lift all boats. And if you think that, then you need to move forward into the 21st century. The best example of race neutral politics or policies for race specific problems is the PPP program. Here we had this $1 trillion program. We know the communities that were ravaged by COVID, the small businesses that are just decimated are Black and brown. I mean, in order, it's Black communities, then Native American communities, then Hispanic communities. And we just put out this program where we don't allocate a specific dollar amount to these communities. We just say, go. These communities have traditionally been locked out of getting access to these resources. And so what happens when you don't specify, when you don't allocate dollars for these particular programs? They're locked out again. And so now we throw our hands up and we're like, why didn't Black folk or Native Americans or Hispanic folk get access to PPP? Because we did the same thing we always do. And so I will just restate my goalpost philosophy in legislating. And if anybody has a question to drill down on it on specific policies, we can. But race neutral policy can never address race specific problems.
That's really powerful. It's important. Here's a question we got before all this, or before the call, about books. Other than My Vanishing Country, which again I can't recommend enough to people, do you have other books that you'd recommend right now that people should be reading?
Yes. So Tiffany Cross has a new book out. It is Say It Louder. I had to remember the name of it. Say It Louder: Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy. It comes out July 6th. That's a really good book. Mark Lamont Hill, Nobody, is an older book, but it documents Ferguson and documents the Black Lives Matter movement. That's a really, really good book. Tears We Cannot Stop, Michael Eric Dyson, is a really, really good book. The Other Wes Moore is a good book. And Wes has a new book coming out that I haven't read yet, but Wes is a phenomenal writer. Whatever Michael's boss, whenever he finishes writing his book that's supposed to come out this fall, I mean, what is he writing on each side, handwritten on a notepad?
We're all excited. We all can't wait.
Can he finish it? Goodness gracious. There are just, White Fragility, of course, is a good book. It was a difficult read for me, but it was a good book. How to Be an Anti-Racist is a good book. Another difficult read for me, but a good book. And so there are a lot of those type books that we can ascribe to, which are really good.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Can I jump in on that question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Please do.
So one, President Obama recently recommended that everyone go back and reread or read for the first time The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin.
I was going to say James Baldwin, yes.
It's a really quick read. And if you go to our Twitter accounts, there is actually a short piece that was written that folks can read who really want to try to get something done. Also, Beverly Tatum's book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria, was something that spoke to my soul when I was very young. And all of a sudden, it's creeping back up into the best sellers list. And so encourage people to take a look at that. Also, if you haven't read Warmth of Other Suns, transformative. And especially like for me as a child of the Great Migration, helped to put so much in context to me and put names and faces to what we hear about redlining and what we heard about the promise of the North and how that was unrealized and what that means for what's happening today. So there's some oldies but goodies that I think it's still important to look at. And then Dr. Kendi, who Bakari mentioned, actually put out a list of books that folks should consider beyond the books that he's written. And I'm not sure how he is writing so fast. And
he has another one. He has another one that just came out, a children's book.
I know, a children's book. I was like, I have no idea.
Print that out in 2 weeks.
What amazing thing you're doing.
Yes.
But yeah, encourage folks to take a look at those.
Thanks so much, Michael. Super helpful. We're nearing the end of our time, and I just, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, and we're going to need to spend a lot of time talking about this going forward for sure. I really appreciate both of you spending some time with us on this Juneteenth, and I would like to just let you each have kind of a final word, if you will, a call to action for the folks on the phone about, again, how we make sure that this moment does not pass until there is a movement for real change. That's, as Bakari said, now, not down the road. So Michael, let me start with you. Just anything you want to end with.
Yeah, sure. First, let me say thank you to Bakari for the kind words. Thank you for your leadership. Also, I miss the beard. That was a great beard, and I hope you bring it back. But also, I just think about the way that you've given voice to the pain that so many of us have felt at times where I didn't want to pick up a phone and talk to my friends. Nevertheless, talk to the nation. So thank you for continuing to lead in that way. To everyone that's watching, thanks again for the work that you're doing. And it's about the long haul. It's what Bakari talked about. how do we put mile markers out here so that this does not become another moment that we're looking back a few months from now? How are you thinking about, we're gonna create every 3 months. We're putting dates on the calendar now. We're putting demands on, we're checking in. We're agreeing to meet with these constituencies. We are putting these deadlines on ourselves to make sure that we really are thinking about the long haul and holding people accountable at all levels. And also just really taking this opportunity for all folks, especially non-Black folks, to think about your privilege that you carry and how you are not only carrying the banner for Black Lives Matter, but going and talking to your own folks, talking to other white legislators, talking to other members of your family, talking to other business leaders, and really thinking about how we have to get to systemic change and not just badging the pain and the continued systemic violence that Black Americans feel. Really going back and thinking about allyship amongst each other and helping to change the game that way.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for being here. Bakari, I just, before I let you have the final word, I want to just thank you for being here too. It means a lot to me, and it's so great to see you. And just your book was so powerful. Thanks for writing it. So yeah, I'll let you have the final word. Maybe with a question, which is, we had someone ask about if we're sitting here a year from now on Juneteenth, the now federal holiday. What do you think? What do you hope happened over that year, and where are we then? You can take it, or you can punt that one and just make your own closing statement, whichever you want.
Yeah, hopefully we will be reimagining what a Biden-Harris type of America looks like. But that takes some work to get there. You like how subtle that was, didn't you, Michael? You see how I slid that in there. I'm encouraged, and I want everyone on this call, because this is a unique group that we're a part of, to dream big, right? And to really, really, really take stock at the community around you and the communities we represent and the communities we serve, right? And to take a moment and realize that sometimes we get caught up in the trappings of politics and elected office, and we get caught up in the trappings of, the receptions and the lobbyists and people who want us to come speak at their church, right? But let's take that off for a minute, and let's worry about our constituents who still live in food deserts, where they can't go 3 and 4 miles and get access to quality fruits and vegetables. Let's talk about how, because those reps who are in southern states where they didn't expand Medicaid now have rural hospitals that are closing down. Let's talk about how, my wife nearly died in childbirth because Black women are 4 times more likely than white women to die because of African-American female mortality and those issues that we have to deal with. Let's tackle some of these issues. This is the group that can tackle these issues that have been plaguing us for so long, these systemic institutionalized issues. And so let's not get caught up in the trappings, and let's not take the easy policy initiatives that sometimes may get you a banner or get you a good editorial page write-up. But let's tackle some of these really difficult. And I was on with Tobias Reed the other day, and me and Tobias, we believe in R&D. I don't know if Michael over at the Obama Foundation understand what R&D is, but it ain't research and development. It's rob and duplicate. And so if they're doing it good somewhere else, let's build that framework where we can reach out and remember that we chose to go into politics in whatever fashion because we wanted to become a part of something larger than ourselves. I wanted to go into politics not to be like Barack Obama, slightly to be like Deval Patrick, but even more to be like Julian Bond. That's where I grew up, right? And, I wanted to change the system from within. And so I just challenge everybody to want to dream big, be a part of a system that they're going to change and be fundamental change agents as we do it. Thank you, Debbie. I hope everybody gets a copy of my Vanishing Country and shares it with your friends. And I'm very blessed and fortunate enough to be able to call the people on this call my friend. And I truly, truly appreciate that.
Thank you so much for both of you. We are in this for the long haul with you, Bakari, and really both appreciate so much you being here. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to everyone real soon.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Bakari. Thanks, everybody.